Hello again. The Practical Animal Channel is dedicated to the public understanding of conservation by broadcasting interviews with conservationists around the globe. These are their stories. The channel showcases what they do and highlights the skill set they need. Through these recorded interviews, they highlight where our knowledge gaps lie and suggest projects for students. Today's guest is the managing director of a Big Five game reserve in Zululand, South Africa. Karen Odendaal is an expert on wild dogs, Temminck's pangolins, and rhino. She lists jobs with these animals, explains what being a reserve manager involves, and identifies knowledge gaps and conservation projects on these animals. You won't want to miss this one.
Karen, your job sounds terrific. Please, can you explain for the viewer what you do?
So I am a reserve manager or managing director of a big private game reserve in northern KZN, which means my job entails wildlife management, habitat management, and conservation. If viewers would like to find out a bit more about that, they're welcome to visit the website. It is www.manyoni, that is MANYONI.co.za.
Why is your work important, please?
There's not a lot of people that are focused on wildlife management, habitat management, and environmental protection. And so every person that we can get to jump on board and fight for the plight is important.
What jobs are there for early career conservationists anywhere in the world with rhinos, African wild dogs, leopard tortoises, and Temminck's pangolins that you work with, please?
But there's research opportunities with rhino, wild dog, pangolins, etc. There's a lot that we don't know about these species. So research critical. There's also physical management and monitoring job opportunities associated with pangolins, with people that are working towards fundraising and protection of the species. And that involves obviously assisting with the funds needed for the protection and management and monitoring of the various species. And all three of those roles are obviously critical to ensure the long-term sustainability of these programs.
Karen, you are manager of, forgive my pronunciation, Manyoni Game Reserve. What does your job involve, please?
On a managerial level, there's an administrative component, the wildlife management. That includes doing annual game census, population monitoring, specific species monitoring. We also have a horn trimming program in place associated with our white and black rhino. We also have pangolins that we have rehabilitated back into the wild. We also do work associated with fire management. We have a perimeter fence that contain all of the wildlife within the park. A big component of the work is associated with fence maintenance and ensuring the perimeter fence is intact to keep people out and wildlife in. It's a very important part of what we do. And then there's the law enforcement component, there's a poaching unit and a canine unit that work towards the wildlife protection in the reserve. We deal with a number of different wildlife or illegal wildlife issues, such as snaring for bushmeat, and then rhino poaching being a very real issue as well. We also spend a lot of work doing habitat management, which is an important component. Without the grass and the trees and the soil, we wouldn't be able to sustain the rhinos and the elephants and the wild dogs, and all We also do bush encroachment. Woody plants become encroached, obviously with climate change and increased carbon in the atmosphere. We're seeing more rapid growth, which means that without fires to combat bush encroachment, and as well as that with the help of certain species, some of the areas become very, very thick, and we have to manually clear to ensure that the grazing doesn't deteriorate. I'm going into a lot of detail, but this is all of the components associated with managing a park. It ranges from wildlife protection and law enforcement, habitat management and rehabilitation, to wildlife management and monitoring, and then obviously we have specific species programs as well that come with a whole different set of tasks.
Karen, by any chance, do you use wildlife cameras? And if so, what make and model do you find most suitable and why?
So there are very, very effective tools that we use, in particular for pangolin monitoring. It's really, really difficult for us to ascertain when pups are being born from specific females in the population, etc., because they live in burrows, they are nocturnal, they are extremely shy, and so monitoring pangolins to determine whether there's potentially pups that were born, etc., is very tricky. Camera traps are a very effective method. As soon as we can find out where a burrow is, that's been utilized by a pangolin, we place a camera trap at the burrow. And as soon as the female moves in and out with a pup, we're often able then to capture the images. A lot of the images work via GSM, and so that information gets sent to us to headquarters and some alerts to cell phone as soon as the image is captured, which is a really, really effective tool.
Karen, what parts of the job involve, if any, having animals in captivity?
Mainly, the pangolins would be a species that you'd consider in a captive environment, but it's also only for a short space of time. When the pangolins are confiscated from the illegal trade, they are normally in very, very poor condition. The animals are very ill, dehydrated, malnourished. So they go to the veterinary hospital and then get treated there until they're at the point where they're strong enough, their blood work have indicated that they are doing well, and then they get transported to a release site. Manyoni is one of the release sites. We apply a soft release model that ensures that we can monitor the animal while it's adapting to its new environment, and then obviously intervene or make changes should the animal not be adjusting. Depending on the age and the weight and the size of the pangolin, we will keep them in soft release for a couple of days and a couple of months. They're nocturnal. In the late afternoons, get taken out to walk and feed. They get weighed before and after they feed to ensure that there is adequate gain. They get monitored while they're feeding to ensure that they're adjusting well to the new environment. There's adequate species for them to feed on, etc. And that is a semi-captive environment that we keep pangolins in until they're at the point where they have to be rehabilitated. And then we obviously also use a captive environment when we are rehabilitating or reintroducing species such as lion, cheetah, wild dogs, etc. Those animals are also not just hard released. They get brought to the reserve where they get placed in a boma or a temporary holding enclosure, which is sort of a hectare, 100 meters by 100 meter size area, which is fenced and electrified. They've got shade, water, and we provide food for them. And this allows the animals, be it cheetah, lion, wild dog, to just acclimatize to the new environment. And if you keep them in a holding enclosure for between 4 and 6 weeks, it allows them to adapt to the environment. But the park as a whole is completely wild space where the animals are free roaming and live in a natural environment.
Karen, how would you describe conservation of the species that you work with today, rhino, wild dog, Temminck's pangolin, and what skills are needed to do what you do with those species?
We are living in an environment where there's less space available for wild dogs that require large areas Rhinos have become a very, very valued commodity in the illegal trade environment in terms of horn, and that's a serious challenge. Similarly, so for pangolins, they're persecuted for their scales, and their meat's considered a delicacy. So again, fiction associated with it, and then obviously also reintroductions, rehabilitations, to try and establish viable populations or get these populations to be in a situation where there's positive growth. So I've got a master's degree in ecology, which has provided me with a lot of the sort of theoretical knowledge that is required in order to understand how to conduct research, how to evaluate the data sets in order to come up with a result as to what is happening with a specific species or population or individual animal. So those skills those are research focused skills, but even as a manager, the research skills are critical, because at the end of the day, we don't necessarily have the time or the resources to do a full-blown research project on a specific population and how they are adjusting, etc. But there are ways where we can make very quick monitoring assessments to come up with a reasonable answer. We'll never know it all, but we do apply an adaptive management approach, which means that we will make an assessment on a number of different factors that which is information that we were able to collect. So I guess the research background is critical, but also being a very practical person, understanding your subject matter is very, very important. So being able to read up about the species or what environment that you're working in, and ensuring that you've got as much knowledge around that as possible. And then experience is key. Being around in a similar environment for extended period of time means that you are able to gain knowledge as to when the rainy season starts, when the rainy season ends, and if you're not getting rain, that you're potentially going into a low rainfall year. What are the potential outcomes from a low rainfall year, and what do we have to manage for to try and limit loss and mortalities and all the things that goes with that? And that, unfortunately, is something that you gain through experience.
Taking the 21st century as a whole, Karen, how do you see the skills that people will need to conserve rhino, Temminck's pangolin, African wild dogs? How do you see those skills changing?
Well, I hope they're going to be around in 20 years from now. That'll be the first thing for me. Technology will become so advanced that we would be able to potentially monitor every species' heart rate, movement through time and space, as well as monitoring vitals, temperature, heart rates, whether they're in sleep mode, whether they're active, whether they're giving birth, whether they're potentially pregnant. All of those things I think we'll be able to monitor through some form of tag or satellite device or whatever that would be small enough to mount with extended battery time, which are the challenges we're currently facing now. And we'll be able to do it all remotely. I feel like something will be missing, because being able to sit and watch firsthand an animal move through the space and making those observations, being there, is I think what makes me good at my job, because doing it remotely is very, very different. But unfortunately, I think that is the space that we're moving in.
Karen, when you're dealing with the animals in captivity, what nutritional challenges do you face?
So the pangolin work is actually very, very hard work, because we are walking in big 5 areas amongst rhinos and lions and all the things to allow the pangolins to feed in a natural space. They dig and find their own ants and termites, and through experience we are able to assess when they've gotten to a point where they've filled their bellies for the day and they're ready to snuggle up in a burrow and sleep. With regards to predators, it is a challenge and often a hard topic to discuss when you have people that are quite sensitive to, the wildlife environment. We have to harvest game species such as impala, and then we feed that to the animals while they're in a captive environment. Again, there's no nutritional challenges, because we ensure that the carcass is taken as a whole. So in other words, all of the red organs are within the carcass still. Heart, liver, kidneys, etc. Those organs obviously form part of their natural diet, and it's critical for animals even in a captive environment. So we are relatively strict about feeding whole carcasses to the animals in an captive environment, and basically simulate natural predation. And therefore, even in that environment, the animals are doing extraordinarily well. There are things that we have to manage for, particularly and that kind of thing, especially with wild dogs. But all of these things you learn from experience and are able to manage for and work towards preventing.
Are there any behaviors that it is useful to train those animals to do in order to facilitate their management?
With regards to wild dogs and predators, such as lion in particular, we have to be very careful when we are allowing animals to habituate to the new environment. Because we have fences up, we have to introduce new genetics into the population to prevent inbreeding. And those animals are grounded in a temporary holding enclosure. What then happens is that we also have to feed those lions, and there's a risk when they associate the vehicle with food or the humans with food. So we have to ensure that that association is not made. The lions, once released, might be chased after a vehicle, different vehicles, different people, different things all the time. So they can't, so that there's no association with in the way that they're being fed. And that is obviously important, especially with species such as lion, which are very strong animals and a risk to human safety. For wild dogs and some in particular, we focus on using a call-up system. Wild dogs are much more prone to snaring and injury, etc. They're also far more prone to escaping the park, picking up snaring, returning back into the park, etc. They're far more challenging animal species to manage for. So we create an association with the protocol and the feeding, so that once they've been released, if we need to intervene with potentially having to immobilize a specific individual to treat it for an injury, etc., we are able to play the protocol, and those dogs would immediately respond and potentially give us the opportunity to immobilize a specific individual in the population.
Karen, how easy is it to obtain veterinary assistance for field operations?
We are very fortunate in the area that we live. We have 2 or 3 veterinarians. We are in the sort of hub of wildlife areas in northern KZN, and therefore have a number of veterinarians that are operating in both domestic, livestock and wildlife environment.
Karen, what advice can you offer an early career conservationist wanting to do what you do, manage a reserve in South Africa?
Start off with the basics. Ensuring you have a degree or honours, whatever, some form of training in an academic environment, a diploma even for that matter, in wildlife management, or honours degree in biology, or whatever the case may be, is a good start. But then I started my career guiding. Guiding is a ranger that takes guests out on a safari, driving through the park, showing them all the various species. If you have not been brought up in an environment where you're exposed to wildlife from a very young age, it allows you to gain experience, learn about animal behavior all the time, educate yourself while you're educating your guests. And it is a really, really good way to get into the industry. And then obviously after that, it takes a lot of hard work and perseverance, going the extra mile to push yourself to get into an environment where you could turn it into a career. It means you have to work twice as hard. Working hours is not an 8 to 5. You eat, sleep, and drink conservation. It's a lifestyle. It's not just a career. And often when people get into the gardening environment, it gives them a glimpse of that, and they can therefore decide whether this is something that they want to do. It's a hard job, it's often a harsh environment.
I got chased by a wild elephant once and it scared the living doo-doo out of me. Karen, what personal qualities does a person need to be a manager of a nature reserve in South Africa?
I think patience and resilience, being able to adapt. Change is constant. There is not a single day in my life that is the same. There's not a single situation that is the same. There is not a single issue that requires intervention that is the same. So you have to be very flexible in terms of your work hours, in terms of your approach to situations, in terms of your daily plans, your weekly plans, and yearly plans. I make a list every day of my life for what I intend on achieving that day. And 99.99% of the time, I do about 2 things on the list, and all of the rest gets carried over to another rainy day. So you have to be able to adapt to a very dynamic environment, and like I said, everything changes, which requires a lot of people that require structure and routine. It's not going to work for you. Definitely not. You need to also be quite brave. A lot of the environment that we work in is challenging, scary, life-threatening even, and so you will be put out of your comfort zone more often than not, whether it be working in an environment where you could be at risk because you're walking in big five every day, be it fighting fires, having to, post an immobilized lion in the bush, wake up an immobilized animal, all of the risks that goes with what we do. We obviously take as much care as we can, but it is a high-risk environment to work in, and so it could be very scary for people if you don't have your brave socks on every day.
Yeah, nowadays I look down at my waistline and I think I wouldn't stand too much of a chance if it was between me and a rhino. Aaron, where do the gaps lie in our knowledge of the conservation needs of the animals you work with, rhinos, wild dogs, pangolins? What would make a good research project for students from, bachelor's level up to PhD level? Karen, please.
Species such as pangolin, we know so little about them. How often do they give birth? What is their inter-pup period or inter-calving period, as we would say? What are the issues that affect pup survival other than predation? Habitat choice and habitat suitability. How do they select for the areas that they move in? How do they associate with one another? Because we're able to put tags on them and monitor their movements, again, in a non-invasive manner remotely. And that is starting to slowly give us some information and fact around them. But again, there are more questions, and with every answer we get, or a little bit of information, we get another 5 questions gets raised. With Rhino, for instance, there's a lot of research being done around horn trimming and potentially how that affects their behavior, their social environment, or social interactions with one another. There's a concern. Obviously, we know the rhinos use their horns for protection, to protect their calves against predation, but then also bulls use it as a territorial, or to fight for territory, and social dominance. So therefore, if there's not a sharp horn that's going to inflict a puncture wound on the opponent and eventually push him off, does it mean that these territorial battles are prolonged for extended periods of time? Does it mean that the territorial males are slightly less fit because they're exhausting themselves in territorial battles that are extended? Does it potentially relate to fertility and reduced conception because the bulls are potentially less fit? How does it affect the territory in terms of the actual space use? Does that become a lot more fluid? How do the females respond to this? So the list is endless. We haven't seen massive changes behaviorally, at least. We are finding that there's lower mortality rates, especially amongst bulls, there's less severe puncture wounds being inflicted on their opponent, and therefore lower mortality rates. In terms of habitat selection, etc. And so, yeah, the research environment is still very, very much open to answering a lot of questions that we haven't been able to answer yet.
Karen, you are the managing director at Manyoni Private Game Reserve in Zululand, South Africa. Thank you very much for being on the Practical Animal channel, Karen Odendaal.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to have shared my information with you guys, at least a little bit of knowledge and experience from what we do here.
Thank you, Karen. It was fantastic.